welcome to viewers wherever you are, whatever time of day you have on this spherical planet. Tonight we have a very interesting event. It's a debate. We don't have many of them, but an old sparring partner of mine has kindly agreed to accept my challenge of a debate on the subject of this house believes there is a God. And here is Dr. Jonathan McClatchie. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
How the devil are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How about you?
Yeah, I'm okay. Hot, but okay. I haven't done the second button, so it must be, that's unusual. Must be warm here. So things have happened, haven't they? I mean, since we last met back in October 2014, when we had a chat with, what's his name?
Justin Brierley.
Justin, that's it, Justin Brierley on Premier Christian Radio. And subsequently, we wandered through the streets of London, found a sandwich bar, and you bought my lunch, which was a very honourable thing to do, I thought. and so things have happened since then, because at that time, you'd either just finished your master's or just started your PhD. I'm not sure which. Fill us in.
Yeah, that's right. I think I just started my PhD. I now have completed that. I finished my PhD in January, studying the evolution of the eukaryotic cell cycle at Newcastle University. And I've also subsequently moved to, since finishing my work in Newcastle, I've subsequently moved to Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States, where I hold a position as an assistant professor of biology at Sattler College. And also got married since then as well, last year in 2019. And so, yeah, a lot of things have happened. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. It's a big step, getting married. So this is a new college, I believe, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. We are going into our third year of operation. So we have first, second, and third years now.
And I'm going into my probably third year of my afterlife. Because if you remember, I was just coming up for a heart operation, and I've had that. And so I've managed to survive another 6 years, which is probably 3 years longer than my life expectancy was if I hadn't had the operation.
Excellent.
Anyway, let's get on with the subject. It is, does this house, this house believes there is a God. Okay. I believe you have a presentation for us.
Sure. I'll bring that up right now.
Great. I'll put my notice up for people who want to ask questions.
Okay. Hopefully you can see that.
I can, and there it is.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me on. I'm going to be presenting just for maybe 20 minutes or less my case for the existence of God, which is the argument that I call the moral arena evidence for theism. So let me just start by defining what I mean by a moral arena. Well, a moral arena is simply a community of persons, not necessarily humans, but persons in circumstances where they can engage in what we at least call moral decision-making, where they interact and mold themselves in what gets called morally significant ways. On the hypothesis of theism, a moral choice arena is something that God could be plausibly expected to bring about. Why? Well, intrinsic to God's very character is the quality of moral goodness. And because of this, it's not unlikely for an omnipotent and omnibenevolent entity to bring about the greatest goods. And since the greatest goods require a community of embodied moral agents in a moral choice arena, this is something that it might be plausibly expected for God to bring about. Now, one might, of course, ask at this point why God would choose to bring about embodied agents. After all, couldn't he have created spiritual agents that are not embodied? However, it's being embodied that really amplifies our ability as agents to affect the world and each other. A world of physical pushes and pulls greatly increases the number of opportunities for free agents to morally flourish, mold their character, and cooperate with one another. So I'm saying this is evidence for theism. And to define evidence, I'm using the standard likelihood principle. And it says our being in a moral arena is evidence for theism over atheism. So here's the argument that the probability of the moral arena, given the hypothesis of theism, is greater than the probability of the moral arena given the falsehood of that hypothesis, or the assumption of atheism. In a similar way, you might say that the presence of the accused's fingerprints on a murder weapon is evidence for the hypothesis of guilt over innocence, because the probability of the fingerprints on the hypothesis of guilty is greater than the probability of those fingerprints being on the murder weapon on the hypothesis of innocence. It doesn't prove the guilt hypothesis, but it is nonetheless evidence for that proposition. So for our calculation then, we first need to ask, how much does the hypothesis of theism in and of itself lead one to expect a moral arena? Well, I think this is, on the hypothesis of theism, it's not astronomically unlikely that God would create such a moral arena. But I just want to be conservative, and I'm going to place the probability as just 1% on the hypothesis of theism that God would bring into being a moral arena, such as I've just defined. What, though, is the probability of the moral arena on the hypothesis of atheism? Well, it's to that question I now turn. And what I'm going to be arguing is that the probability of the moral arena on theism is much higher than it is on the hypothesis of atheism, even given the most charitable and generous of assumptions. So I'm only conservatively assuming the probability on theism is as low as 1%, which I think is quite conservative and quite generous. Okay, so what then is the probability of a moral arena existing on the hypothesis of atheism? Well, what do you need? So our estimate is going to be well informed if we can break it up into multiple constituents. For example, to get a moral arena on atheism, we need a universe that's governed by physical laws such as gravity. We need not just any old universe, but a life-permitting universe, a life that's conducive to complex life forms. We also need the origins of life to occur. We need the origins of molecular machines in the cell. We need the origins of multicellularity. We need the origins of animal body plans, the origins of complex brains, which in turn result in consciousness. And finally, we need the presence of objective moral norms and duties in the world. So starting at the top then, on the assumption that God does not exist, there seem to be no arguments that space, matter, or physics would exist. A rational atheist with no evidence for a universe, for example, an atheist who has never had sense perceptions, would reject belief in all that junk until he secured really good evidence for it. Now, I'm going to... So the likelihood of a universe existing on atheism by itself is virtually nil. It's entirely unpredicted. But I just want to be charitable to my atheist friends. And so I'm going to assume, for the sake of argument, that the probability is just 0.1% on atheism, which I think is a fairly charitable assumption. From there, how likely is it that there would be a life-permitting universe in particular? Well, you might be surprised, as Jeff Grimfield here in this article confesses, if you believe the equations of the world's leading cosmologists, the probability that the universe would turn out this way, life permitting, by chance are infinitesimal. In fact, in 2012, an astronomer in Sydney, Australia, called Luke Barnes, published a review of the scientific literature, surveying more than 200 papers. And he says that he can only think of a handful of physicists that oppose this conclusion, and piles that support it. So it's very well established within physics that within the physics community that our universe is finely tuned for life to exist. So in this paper, he lists some of the widely recognized constants that require fine-tuning. For example, the cosmological constant is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 120th power. So on the denominator, that is 1 with 120 zeros after it. And if you get it wrong, the universe either expands so rapidly that you only ever get the 2 lightest elements, or it collapses within picoseconds of the Big Bang. And notice that in such circumstances, no life of any kind could evolve. It turns the next fine-tuning parameter I want to consider was discovered by Roger Penrose at the University of Oxford, who's a mathematical physicist. And according to him, it turns out that nearly all arrangements of particles in the early universe would have resulted in a lifeless universe of black holes. In fact, tiny inconsistencies in the particle arrangements would be acted on by gravity to grow in size, and a positive feedback results since the clumps of particles have an even greater gravitational force on nearby particles. And Penrose's analysis shows that in the incredibly dense early universe, most arrangements of particles would have resulted basically in nothing but black holes, and life certainly can't exist in such a universe. Let's look at a few other constants that require fine-tuning. We've already talked about the cosmological constant. There's also the expansion rate of the universe, which is thought to be fine-tuned at 1 part in 10 to the 55th power, or the ratio of electrons to protons, which is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 37th power. If it was larger or smaller, then chemical bonding would be insufficient for life chemistry. There's the ratio of the electromagnetic force to gravity is 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, or the energy density of the universe, 1 part in 10 to the 55th power. And if it was larger, then gravity would have quickly slowed the expansion and then caused the universe to collapse too quickly for life to form. Or if it was smaller, the universe would have expanded too quickly for galaxies, stars, or planets to form, etc. So we could go through many more of these fine-tuning properties of our universe. But I just want to be generous to the atheists who are watching. I'm just going to assume, for the sake of argument, that the probability of getting a life-permitting universe on the hypothesis of atheism is not as low as 1 in 10 to the 120th power or what have you, but it's only 0.1%. And bear in mind, by the way, that Roger Penrose's calculations concerning the initial low entropy conditions of our universe puts the fine-tuning of the initial low entropy conditions on the order of 1 part in 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 123rd power. So in the denominator, there's more zeros after the 1 than there are subatomic particles in the known universe. So this is just an astronomical level of fine-tuning. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that 0.1% is the probability of a life-permitting universe on atheism. I don't think there can be really any serious debate about that. Okay. Next, given there is a life-permitting universe, how much should you expect that life would actually arise in it? Well, let's look at what some of the things that you would need. You would need the origins of the genetic code. So the language of life is known as a genetic code, and here we see the translation system by which the codons, which are the words, the 3-letter words in a messenger RNA transcript, are taken and translated into proteins. And there's 64 different 3-letter words called codons, and there's 20 different amino acids. So you have this language system, which exhibits, I think, exquisite design and highly unlikely to arise on the hypothesis of chance and physical necessity. There's also the fact that to get the initial proteins in the origins of life requires an extreme amount of fine-tuning as well. So, for example, as I said, there's 20 different types of amino acids that make up proteins, and that means that for a Mosley-length protein of 150 amino acids, there are 20 raised to the power of 150 possible combinations, possible ways of arranging those amino acids. And one question that we can ask is, how prevalent are functional proteins in combinatorial space? And if it turns out that it's astronomically small, then it seems implausible that by chance and necessity, you would be able to find the stable and functional protein structures within that vast array of combinatorial possibilities. This question has been taken up by several scientists, one of which perhaps most famously is Dr. Douglas Axe. And here's his paper from 2004, published in the Journal of Molecular Biology, called Estimating the Prevalence of Protein Sequences Adopting Functional Enzyme Folds. And according to him, so this is a quote from the paper, he says, combined with the estimated prevalence of plausible hydropathic patterns for any fold and of relevant folds for particular functions, this implies the overall prevalence of sequences performing a specific function by any domain-sized fold may be as low as 1 in 10 raised to the 77th power, adding to the body of evidence that functional folds require highly extraordinary sequences. And so what's the problem then? Well, this presents what I call the needle in a haystack problem. Locating the functional folds is like finding a tiny, tiny needle in an enormous haystack and having a very limited time to search. But I just want to be generous for the sake of my atheist friends. And so I'm just going to assume, for the sake of argument, that the probability of getting the origins of life, and bear in mind that for the origins of life, you don't just need one protein structure to arise, but you need many to arise. And I'm just going to assume that the probability is something less than 0.1%. I think that's a fairly generous assumption on the hypothesis of atheism. So, given that you have the origins of life, you also need the origins of molecular machines. And as I said, the probability of getting even single protein structures by chance alone is prohibitively improbable. But when we're dealing with molecular machines in the cell, such as the DNA replisome, for example, that replicates the DNA, you need not just one protein, but many proteins that have to be very specifically crafted to work together in a coordinated fashion. And in 1859, when Darwin published The Origin of Species, he put forward a test by which you could test his theory of evolution by natural selection. He wrote, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And of course, as you might be familiar with, Michael Behe in 1996, in his book Darwin's Black Box, sought to take up Darwin's challenge. And he coined this term of irreducible complexity, which describes the sort of phenomena that Darwin had in mind. He says, by irreducibly complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes a system to effectively cease functioning. And so the idea is that if you have a system that's made of many well-matched interacting components, and the removal of any one of which renders a system not half as useful as it once was, but not functional at all, not performing the function that it once did, then how do you envision that you could build up such a system by slight successive modification, where you retain functionality all along the way? And it turns out there's many examples in biology of irreducibly complex systems, and I'm happy to talk about those in more detail later if people want. But there are many systems like that. There's the DNA replication machinery, for example, on the top right. We also have the bacterial flagellum on the top left that Behe made famous as a kind of a flagship example of irreducible complexity. And we've got the mechanisms also by which both bacterial cells and eukaryotic cells divide. So on the right, we've got the bacterial divisome, and on the bottom left, we have the spindle fibers that attach to the kinetochores and the chromosomes, and that system itself requires a huge amount of coordination or regulation. Is clearly, I would argue, an irreducibly complex system. So, but let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that the probability of getting the molecular machines which are that bear the property of irreducible complexity on the hypothesis of atheism is something less than 0.1%. I think that's a fairly charitable assumption once again. Next, given that you have the origins of molecular machines, then you also need the origins of multicellularity, because we're not just made of one cell, we're made of multiple cells, and not just multiple cells, but multiple types of cell, right? And we have epithelial cells, we have heart cells, we have lung cells, we have neurons, and so forth. And I'm not going to go through that in detail, but we can, if people want to, about some of the hurdles, the probabilistic hurdles that are involved in getting the origins of multicellularity. But just for the sake of argument here, I'm going to say that the probability of getting the origins of multicellularity is something less than 0.1%. I don't think, again, there can be much contest about that. I think it's a highly improbable event on the hypothesis of atheism. But let's just say charitably that the probability is something less than 0.1%. Then you have to get the origins of body plans and the origins of developmental trajectories. So, for example, you go from a single-celled fertilized egg known as a zygote to an adult form capable of reproduction. Paul Nelson, who's a philosopher of biology, coined this term ontogenetic depth, which describes the distance for any animal between a single-celled state and the adult capable of reproduction. And notice that it's no good to traverse halfway across that trajectory to the adult form capable of reproduction, or a quarter of the way across, because then you have not a live organism, but a dead organism. And so how do you put together a process of ontogeny or embryonic development without any foresight? And foresight, of course, is indistinguishable from intelligence. So as soon as you start appealing to foresight, you have an intelligent cause on your hands. Then you have the origins of so again, I'm just going to assume, for the sake of argument, that the probability of getting animal body plans on the hypothesis of atheism is something like 0.1%. Then you have the origins of consciousness, and notice that there's nothing in known physics that would allow someone to look at the brain and conclude, there's someone in there, right? This thing has first-person experiences, right? So you can't predict consciousness by the way of physics and seeing the brain. Now, you might think that, well, only brains with subjective experiences would avoid pain and so forth, and so we can predict that consciousness would evolve because it's adaptive. But that's also wrong, because only people who believe in souls think the mind affects the brain like that. Almost all scientists say your body would do what it does, even if no consciousness existed, because it's a physically closed machine. All your neurons would fire just the same without you, and move your body the same way. And evolutionary history would be identical without subjective experience. So personal subjective conscious experience seems to be something that's quite surprising on the hypothesis of certainly naturalism. So on the falsehood of theism, then I'm just going to say, for the sake of argument, that the probability of getting consciousness, which of course has as a precondition the origins of complex brains as well, is something less than 0.1%, which I think is quite a generous assumption. And I'll be charitable, of course, and assume that these are the only things the atheist needs for a moral choice arena, such as I've described. So then let's multiply those together. So so a 0.1% for each one, which translates on a scale of 0 to 1 as 0.001 for each of these things. And if you multiply those together, you get an overall probability on atheism of 1 times 10 to the minus 24th power. And notice that I've bent over backwards every stage to be as charitable and generous as I can. And so we find this vanishingly small probability on atheism of getting all of these things arising. So then let's consider, how is the moral arena evidence for theism? Well, remember at the start, I give a very charitable estimation of the probability of God creating a moral choice arena as only 1% probability, or 0.01. And that probability, I would argue, is higher than the probability of the moral choice arena arising on atheism as 1 times 10 to the minus 24th power. And therefore, the presence of the existence of the moral choice arena is strong confirmatory evidence for theism over and against atheism. So long as the blue number is greater than the green number, then the moral arena for you is evidence for theism over atheism. And in my case, as you can see, it's very powerful evidence. Now, finally, then, what about the prior probability of God? Because remember that when we're dealing with Bayesian probability theory, we need to also have an estimate of the probability of your hypothesis, just given the background information before we consider your new evidence. And that, of course, has to be factored into your calculation. So I'm just going to assume, for the sake of argument, that the prior probability, that is the probability that God exists, just given the background information, is as low as 10 to the minus 20. Okay, which again, I think is a very generous and charitable assumption. Now, the weight of this evidence is sufficient to overcome a prior probability of 10 to the minus 20 and obtain posterior odds, that's the overall probability that God exists, of 0.9999. And so, as you can see, I think that even bending over backwards to be as generous and charitable as we can to our atheist friends, the evidence of the moral choice arena is very, very, very strong confirmatory evidence for the proposition of theism over atheism. And I will close at that. Thank you for your attention.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Right, let me get mine lined up. We've already got a question in, which I think you can answer very easily. It says, are you a Christian?
Yes, I am a Christian.
Right. Okay, I can take that question down now. Okay, so I take this from a rather different angle. And let me just go through my presentation. Is that no, that's not even the first slide. Where have I got? How did I get there? Hang on, go to the first slide. It's the last slide. Give me a minute. Sorry about this. I don't know how I got to the last slide. The first slide, and that would help, wouldn't it? There we go. Right, number 1 at the bottom. That's a clue. So here we have the question. This house believes there is a God, and Jonathan has explained why.
I don't think you're sharing your screen, John. Sorry.
No. Oh, thank you. Oh, so I'm not. I beg your pardon. I will get this right in a minute. Screen share. Application window. Select. Share and then play. How's that?
Very good.
Good. Right. So I come at this from a different point of view. Jonathan's explained why he thinks that why he believes that there is a God. And I would say that statement is a claim. So what can we do? Should we just accept a claim as true? Or should we investigate it? I think we should investigate it. And here's another claim. This one is that there are intelligent aliens somewhere. That's another claim. And here is another claim, that there is a monster in Loch Ness. And I actually investigated not Ness, not the Loch Ness, but Loch Morar for a monster, which the Loch Morar monster is called Morag, not Nessie. And I spent some time one summer back in the 1960s checking out that claim. So these are claims. And there's been claims throughout history. The historical example is that there's a planet beyond Uranus, and that claim was based on mathematical calculations due to the erratic orbit of Uranus, and the claim was investigated, and the outcome was that it was found. Telescopes were pointed in the directions where it was expected to be. It was observed, and then it was named, and we now call it Neptune. So it's been confirmed by observation. That's the important thing. Science is about observation. I'm sure Jonathan will agree with that because he's just been through a whole education in the subject area of science. Now, I would contend that once something has been confirmed adequately by observation, that requires repeatable, shareable observations. I would say it's now a different item of information that no longer needs believing because it's evidential. As I said, the situation with the claim of Nessie is investigable, and I spent some days investigating Morag using state-of-the-art stuff at the time. You know, there was long lenses, there was a boat that did sonar scanning sideways under the depth of the water. We put in every opportunity that we had at the time to observe Morag, and we didn't observe Morag. So as for Nessie, the state of the Nessie claim is we don't have any evidence for Nessie. So Nessie remains just a claim. And when you don't have any evidence, your claim remains unproven. The default position is skepticism. We are waiting for claimants to provide the evidence to substantiate their claim. So what about intelligent aliens, that claim? And we are also investigating that. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence has been going on from the 1960s. We are listening for potential radio signals in various parts of the universe. And we are improving this. The next generation of SETI instruments will scan for a wider frequency range and a larger area of the known universe. But we haven't found any information yet, no evidence yet. So that the intelligent aliens proposition remains a claim. And the default position is therefore skepticism, waiting for claimants to provide the evidence to substantiate their claim. So the purpose of such investigations is to gather evidence. And this is where Jonathan and I disagree a bit, because my view of scientific evidence is that it is observations. That's all. Positive observations. It's not argument. Argument is something else. You can employ a lawyer to do an argument for you. The more expensive he is, the better he'll do it. But observations are something else. It doesn't matter how clever you are, as long as they can be seen repeatedly, that's good enough. Not dependent upon the skill of the observer. So this God claim, let's go back to the subject. How should we investigate the claim that there is a God? Well, we can't. Now, this is a bit confusing because, as I will show in the later slide, we don't really know what a God is. But most gods are claimed to be immaterial, invisible, beyond observation. And of course, we have no way of investigating anything of that nature. Our technology, our instruments depend on materialism being true. So what's the state of the God claim right now then? There's no evidence for it. God remains a claim. The default unproven position is skepticism. We are still waiting for claimants to provide evidence. And if we ever did develop ways of investigating this immaterial, that's actually an ad hoc fallacy, because you can't provide evidence for your God, and therefore you have to have another claim to bolster it that he's not evidential in some way. And so you've now got a claim supporting, allegedly, the first claim. That's called an ad hoc fallacy. So if we were to somehow develop a piece of equipment, and we've got no idea of how to do this, because of course we don't know what we're looking for. So we can't develop a telescope or a microscope or a radio aerial or anything to detect it. But if we did, let's hypothesize, let's guess that we might one day invent something that can detect the immaterial. If we did that, it would immediately have to be reclassified as material. It would be like a ghost which had materialized. And if there was such a God, a material God, that would be a creature that would be hard to hide. We should be able to detect that agent. We should be able to, especially if, as Jonathan suggests, this God is a benevolent creature, a moral creature. We will be able to observe humanitarian acts being performed by this agent. And such a material God would then, oddly, not require believing, because it would be what's called in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy a concrete fact. And we wouldn't need to believe it any more than we need to believe in the force of gravity. So, that slide seems to be operating backwards. Is a God destined to remain a claim forever? Well, who can say? Maybe it is, but there's always the possibility that a God may reveal itself. That might be called revelation, but it would have to be a very public revelation for it to be classed as a repeatable observation. Otherwise, we are just listening to some individual's claim again. But believers already claim that they have proof. They base their proofs on maths or logic. Now, maths and logic is great stuff, but proofs are absolute concepts. You can have them in maths and maybe to a lesser extent in logic. And sometimes you might be able to have them in logic, although the strongest form of logic relies mostly on definitions. But looking at nature, which is all we can look at, we do not observe absoluteness. Nothing that we have seen can be described as completely certain and absolute. Everything is relative, especially in a universe which has time, because there was a time when all the things that we might claim are absolute never existed. And if we delve into that, we find that we need somebody to decide how long is long enough for something to count as absolute. Is it a century? Is it a second? Is it a nanosecond? It's a nonsense idea. For absoluteness, we require eternity. That doesn't exist. So all of our observations show that everything in the universe is relative to the scale, to the location, and to the movement of the observer, and to everything else. It's all moving. So the concept of proof is not consistent with the natural realm. We can think of it. We have a conceptual realm inside our heads where we can think of anything. Real things, false things, imaginary things, Humpty Dumpty. What we need is a way of distinguishing these concepts, including proof, from false things like Humpty Dumpty. And the only way we can do that is by comparison with the natural realm to find out whether observations are consistent with our concept. Meanwhile, I can't disprove God. In fact, Jonathan talked about atheism, but I would contend that he then went on to describe naturalism. His whole presentation was about naturalism rather than atheism, because atheism just means that I am not convinced by your claims. It's not an ideology. There's no beliefs. You can't have a belief system out of not believing in something. It just doesn't make sense. So Jonathan then went on. He didn't mention this because he equates probably atheism with naturalism. And I meet this a lot in my encounters. So my position is that I can't disprove a being that allegedly exists in some immaterial, unnatural realm outside of reality, but the burden of the proof is on the claimant. The burden of the evidence, let's say, is on the claimant. Let's take a look at this God, and I've put him in quotes here, hypothesis. Why have I put that in quotes? Because it isn't really a hypothesis, but I'll come on to that in a minute. What do we mean by God? We've talked about what we mean by belief. Now let's talk about what we mean by God. Well, we don't know. Different religions make different claims. Sometimes they believe in one God, like Jonathan does, or sometimes they believe in many, like the Hindus do. Sometimes this God is the creator of the universe and all life. Sometimes it's a destroyer. Sometimes it's omnipotent, if infinite, omnipresent, or omnibenevolent, as Jonathan was saying, with his moral universe or moral arena. And then sometimes it's a wrathful creature. It's a Lord that you have to worship and that might send you to hell. And it's, as Jonathan indicated, in his mind, it's a source of morality and forgiveness. But in other religions, it's a destroyer. So what is a God is the hurdle that we've got to overcome. Now, as I said, the God claim is not a hypothesis, because a scientific hypothesis must be investigable. And as I pointed out, since the gods are claimed to be immaterial, we can't investigate them. So Jonathan gave us some of his proofs, mostly based on Bayesian probability. But there are other so-called proofs for a creator God, like, for example, causality. And this relies on, the domino effect. Everything must have a cause, and therefore, at the beginning of everything, there must have been something that flicked the first domino, and that sort of thing couldn't have been part of the universe, so it must have been outside of it. Well, give me some evidence. So what is the difference between maths and logic? Well, they are provable, because in maths you can invent things, can't you? You can invent lines that have length but no width, and points that have location but no area. And logic's the same. You can invent definitions, and then you can circularly prove that they mean what you stated they meant in deduction at the beginning. Now, science isn't like that. Science relies on evidence. Because there's no proof in nature, we have to rely on evidence. And to us, evidence is observation. There are lots of aspects of maths that are unreal. I mentioned a couple, but of course, infinity is unreal. Nothing is unreal. We've never found any nothing. We can't make any nothing. We've no evidence that there is such a thing as nothing. So I've got to contend that proof is idealistic and unreal, and therefore it is subservient to evidence. And that's why I'm asking Jonathan to provide us with some evidence. So since we can't investigate the God claim, what is the situation now? Well, we're in that default position of skepticism. It's the same as disbelief in a way. And the proponents are the ones that have the burden of supporting their claim. And it's exactly the same as it is for Russell's teapot or the flying spaghetti monster. Thank you. So let's see what other questions we've got now. Right, here's one from Mark Hammonds about irreducible complexity. You okay to have a go at that, Jonathan?
Sure. So he asks, doesn't the claim of irreducible complexity in biology always act merely as a placeholder for current ignorance? He got coagulation and flagella wrong. ID equals degenerating problem shift. Okay. So there's a few points that were made there. The first is that it's a placeholder for current ignorance, and this is sometimes phrased as the God of the gaps kind of argument, which is to say that we can't explain or account for feature X, so we'll just plug in God or intelligent designer to explain that which we are ignorant of, and it kind of serves as a placeholder of that which we don't know. And then as science progresses and advances, God has to retreat with each new advance in scientific learning. And that's not really the way that intelligent design works. So in the case of irreducible complexity, I would argue that a mind is uniquely able to visualize a complex end goal and bring together everything that's necessary to realize or to actualize that complex end goal. Whereas natural selection and genetic mutation and other mindless evolutionary processes don't have the ability to visualize a complex end goal and then bring things together that are necessary to actualize that end goal. So is the existence of irreducibly complex structures more probable on the hypothesis of design or in the falsehood of design? I would argue that it's much more probable on the hypothesis of design for the reason I just gave. So as for the flagellum, I disagree that Behe was wrong on that. I've written extensively on that. It'd be difficult to get into all the details there, and the same is true, I think, of the blood clotting cascade as well. So I mean, the popular objection that's raised, which was popularized by Kenneth Miller, who's a biologist at Brown University, is the idea that of co-option, or otherwise known as acceptation, which is the idea that you could so for example, most famously, the type 3 secretion system is found in the flagellum and is involved in exporting flagellum components, such as the flagellin monomers or subunits that make up the propeller of the flagellum. But in other bacteria which lack flagella, it can serve as the type 3 secretion system, which injects poisons into multicellular organisms. So, for example, Yersinia pestis, which is the causal agent of bubonic plague, has a type 3 secretion system, even though it doesn't make flagella. But there's various lines of evidence that suggest, I think strongly, that the type 3 secretion system is actually an evolutionary degradation product rather than a precursor of the flagellum. For instance, it makes evolutionary sense because there's a selection pressure for for swimming through water, swimming through liquid, before there is a selection pressure for injecting poisons into multicellular organisms. Also, organisms which have type 3 secretion systems, such as Yersinia, also have the genes for making flagella, even if no flagella are assembled. And there's various other lines of evidence that support that as well. And also, there's the construction of the flagellar motor is very finely choreographed and requires an intricately designed assembly process. And that itself, I would argue, is irreducibly complex. So the fly decapping protein, for example, in the flagellum, if you were to knock it out, and this has been done experimentally, you'll lose the flagellin subunits into the surrounding medium. So I would argue that the flagellum does have an irreducibly complex core of components.
Well, my view on this, you've illustrated some of your responses to the arguments against irreducible complexity, but I've written on this in the Atheist Alliance International's blog section. The trouble with irreducible complexity is it's only irreducible until somebody works out how to reduce it. And if you can, it starts by claiming that we have something amazingly complex up here, and we can't imagine how it might have come about because of its complexity. Well, let's not start there. Let's accept that there's been a progression. Life has become, over the last 3.5 billion years, life has progressed from incredibly simple organisms to incredibly complex organisms. And during that time, there's been plenty of opportunity for complexity to develop. And as you indicated, sometimes the final function is not the original intention. It's changed along the way. What served one purpose early on in the beginnings of the tree of life, I don't like that expression, has been modified, because this is how evolution works. It's by modification of the existing. It's not by suddenly starting with something complex. It's not by zap producing something complex. And I mean, evolution is more like starting with a car and making it into a slightly better car. And it's not like starting with a tank and magically turning it into a jet aircraft. That's more like creation.
Okay, so let's consider an example of an irreducibly complex system so we can discover how this might work in practice. So I give one of the examples I gave in my presentation was the DNA replisome, or the replication machinery that replicates DNA. And as you know, there are many components that are necessary for DNA replication to work. There's the DNA polymerase, which is the enzyme which is responsible for copying the strands of the DNA double helix, and it's copied in a semi-conservative manner, so that each of the two strands of the double helix will then serve as a template for the formation of the new daughter DNA double helix. And without the DNA polymerase, no replication could take place at all. And so the RNA primers, which have to be laid down in order to get the DNA replication started in the first place, would be laid down at the origin of replication, but then the subsequent replication would take place. The DNA ligase, which links the DNA fragments that are produced on the lagging strand, because the lagging strand has to be synthesized discontinuously because it's the reverse orientation. And in the absence of the ligase enzyme, which links the DNA fragments, the newly replicated DNA strands will remain as fragments, because the Okazaki fragments are basically where the result from the laying down of the primers, the RNA primers on the lagging strand, and then synthesis of DNA from those primers that are laid down by primates. The sliding clamp is also responsible and required for clamping the DNA polymerase onto the DNA strand. Otherwise, it would frequently fall off the DNA template and wouldn't stay on long enough for it to be at all functional. Also the RNA excision enzymes, which are required. If you didn't have those, the RNA fragments would remain covalently attached to the newly replicated DNA fragments, which would be also a disaster. DNA helicase, which is responsible for unwinding the DNA double helix or unzipping the DNA double helix to prepare for copying. Without that, the DNA polymerase would stall because it cannot separate the strands of the template DNA ahead of it, and little or no DNA would be synthesized. In the absence of primase, the RNA primers wouldn't be able to begin on either the leading or the lagging strand, and DNA replication therefore cannot begin. You also have the single-stranded binding proteins, which are responsible for binding to each of the strands of the double helix to prevent them from re-annealing during copying. So if any of those components was missing, you would have a non-functional system. And what's really interesting about DNA replication is that is what I call sometimes irreducible complexity on steroids, because you need a replication machinery in order for replication to occur in the first place. Because natural selection itself presupposes that you have a self-replicating system. And so you can't invoke natural selection to account for the origins of self-replication without assuming the existence of the very thing you're trying to explain. So, it seems very implausible to me that a system as complex as DNA replication could have arisen by a process of slight modification from pre-existing precursors through the dual forces of chance and physical necessity.
Well, you say it seems implausible to you, and I would say that's an example of the personal incredulity fallacy, because there has been, as I said, 3.5 billion years for this all to happen, and therefore, but the other thing is you're not giving us any evidence that it hasn't happened, and nobody currently thinks that DNA was the origin of the coding mechanism. I don't know whether you had an opportunity to watch last week's event when the guest on my show was Professor Lee Cronin from Glasgow University.
I didn't, but go ahead.
Well, it is still available. It's interesting to watch, because he's got, we talked about abiogenesis. He's got some interesting ideas based on progression, based on the emergence of complexity, which we've observed happening in so many cases. There's no reason to think that it didn't happen in all cases.
So in the case of the origins of life, and I've written quite extensively on the origins of life, all origins of life models fail in particular at the hurdle of explaining the origins of biological information and the genetic code. And you mentioned that DNA wasn't the first, is widely regarded as not being the first information-bearing molecule, and you're completely correct. There's the RNA world hypothesis. There's a number of problems with the RNA world scenario. One is that because one of the differences between RNA and DNA is on RNA you've got the presence of the extra 2' hydroxyl group, which renders it renders RNA more unstable than DNA chemically, and also RNA generally is single-stranded, which also renders it less stable than DNA. And so it seems very unlikely to me that RNA could have survived in the environment of the primitive Earth, and also you've got to explain how you get from the RNA world to the DNA protein world, which we now have, and also the ribozyme engineering experiments have not convincingly demonstrated, I think, that the RNA can fully self-replicate. So I'm a little bit skeptical of the RNA world scenario.
Well, the RNA world scenario is not the only alternative. But there you go again with your seems unlikely. I'm sorry, but seems unlikely is not evidence for creation.
It's mathematically improbable. Take for example and I give scientific reasons for that. It wasn't just a gut feeling, but and take the origins of the genetic code, for example. in every realm of experience, as we look around the world, language systems and decoding systems are habitually associated with conscious minds.
Well, only because they do exist now. But the alternative presupposes that that information began with the first encoding and decoding system. Prior to that, there was no information. Now, we're intelligent beings. We can look back and see what we call information all everywhere. But it depends on what you mean by information. If it is biological information, then you need a coding system for information to begin.
Right.
But,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to deal with your mathematical reasoning, which is it's a persuasive argument. I'll give you that, but it's not a persuasive conclusion. You see, in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the reason we are doing that is because of a very similar mathematical argument. It's so improbable, given the huge size of the universe, the vast, uncountable number of planets that we are discovering, thanks to the Hubble telescope and the more recent one that's just about to get into action, and thanks to the immense depth of time that has passed since the beginning of the universe, if indeed there was a beginning, and not everyone thinks that is the case. But so because of that huge mathematical equation, Frank Drake, not the navigator, Frank Drake came up with the inference that the likelihood is strong that there is intelligent life elsewhere. Do we take that as a final conclusion? No, we're looking for it. So you can make a mathematical argument, but you need to convert it by adding observation to it to make a conclusion.
But I would disagree with. So let's take, for example, a thought experiment where you're an archaeologist and you discover some sort of inscription on an artifact, and you would be, I think, warranted in inferring the existence of a designer, even if you didn't have the designer because he was long since dead, right? He died thousands of years ago, let's say, but you still have what he produced, and you would infer, using, I think, a similar sort of likelihood ratio, even if only implicitly, that what you're observing is more probable on the hypothesis that it was inscribed by an actual designer than on the falsehood of that hypothesis. Am I not right?
Sure. But that's not a valid analogy, is it? Because we know that inscriptions are made by intelligent designers, but in the natural realm, we see nature doing all sorts of things without the need for an agent. We see her making canyons. We see her causing tsunamis. We see her spewing volcanoes. We know that a lot of what goes on this planet and elsewhere in the universe requires no agency.
So I would disagree in regards to the sufficiency. This is probably a big point of contention between us. I would disagree in regards to the sufficiency of blind mechanisms or mindless mechanisms to account for the complexity and design that we see in life. So I would disagree with the efficacy of natural selection and random genetic mutation. And I gave a few arguments earlier. There's many more I could list. But in terms of,
there you go, referring to the complexity of life. Let's refer to simple life. And then it doesn't seem to be so improbable. Life hasn't always been as complex. You've only got to look back through the geological record to see that many moons ago, complex life was absent.
So to get even
simple life existed. So let's not. What we're doing here is polarizing. We're saying this fantastic complexity cannot have been caused from these remaining rocks, but we're missing out all the stages in between.
So I would disagree with you. I think that even the very simplest forms of life are exquisitely designed and complex. I mean, even the simplest cells, which are obligate parasites, have 300 or more genes.
Well, yes, but they are a backwards evolution, as you suggested with something else earlier on. they have devolved. I don't like that word, but they have lost features that their ancestors once had. Let's take a look at the really beginning forms. I mean, it's like viruses. They've lost features. They're just nuclei now. They've lost all the features. You could argue that viruses are not alive except when they've hijacked a cell. The rest of the time, they're equivalent to a crystal. But let's take a look at some of the really simple forms of life, most of which, of course, no longer survive, which may not have been cells. I mean, there are a few creatures living on this planet today that have survived from a pre-cellular era.
Are you talking about viruses in particular?
No, not viruses. No, I'm thinking of slime molds and other creatures which have sponges, for example, which are not proper cells. They're assembly. Take a look at the interview I did last week, and you'll see that Professor Cronin is attempting to make simple encoding and decoding structures, which are not cells, but they are like lipid vesicles. And that is possibly how life began. Not complex at all. But I've got another question here to put up to you.
He asks, to ask a Popperian question after Karl Popper, is there any state of affairs or evidence that would cause Jonathan to abandon his argument? Well, sure, absolutely. And typically, scientific theories are not abandoned by a single piece of anomalous data. It's not that there would be one single piece of disconfirmatory evidence, and that's why most philosophers of science actually now reject Karl Popper's demarcation criterion of falsifiability. It's one of the reasons.
He's still very popular in the science world.
Yeah, but in philosophy of science, which is the relevant field, he's.
Excuse me, I'm shutting my windows.
So yeah, I mean, if it were the case that the universe were eternal, for example, if there were good evidence that the steady-state theory of cosmology was correct, then that would significantly undermine the theistic hypothesis. It wouldn't necessarily refute it, but it would significantly undermine my confidence in it. Or if it were the case that it turned out in the fullness of time that the universe, although it initially appeared to be fine-tuned for life to exist, actually isn't as fine-tuned as we thought it was, that would significantly reduce my confidence in the theistic proposition. Or if it turned out that natural selection and genetic mutation actually could explain quite well the design that we see in biology, that would again undermine significantly my confidence in the theistic hypothesis, and so forth.
Okay. Well, you mentioned fine-tuning, and it's a bit of a failure, isn't it? I mean, if the intelligent designer designed a universe to support life and fine-tuned all the parameters to make that possible, he didn't do a very good job, did he? I mean, most of the universe is extremely hostile towards all forms of life. We're lucky that we happen to live on the one planet that we're aware of where life does exist at the moment. We may become aware of others shortly, but the position is fine-tuning is just a fact. It's a mysterious fact, maybe, but our ignorance of how it came about is not evidence for any God, let alone the Christian one.
Yeah, so on the issue that most of the universe is inhospitable to life, and you're completely correct about that particular fact, your argument against the fine-tuning argument presupposes, I think, as a hidden premise in there, that the only reason that a God could have for the only purpose God could have for the universe is to populate the whole universe with life, or to have it teeming with life. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. So, for example, from a biblical perspective, which is the viewpoint from which I come, Psalm 19:1 says that the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So the universe, from a Christian point of view, one of the main purposes of it is to portray and reveal the glory of God, the majesty of God. And so I think that there could be other purposes for which God created the universe as well, to reveal his glory to observers. And I think there are actually good reasons to think that the universe itself is not only fine-tuned for light, but also fine-tuned for discovery. And a number of philosophers of science and also astronomers have made an argument like that. And the other point you made was about, what was the other point you raised?
I've completely forgotten.
Okay.
You quoted the Bible. Now, if you want to debate the authenticity of the Bible with me, that's another show.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we'll stage that for the future,
mm-hmm.
if you're willing. So we're coming up to the end of our time now, but I have a few more questions coming in here. And one of them reminds me of a question I had in mind. Oh, no, it doesn't. Now, this is asking about, the unintelligent aspects of mind that we see.
I also just remembered the other part of your question. So I'll just address that quickly. That was about how the fine-tuning isn't evidence for God. And I would disagree with that. In fact, you said in your presentation that there's no evidence for God. And I think I would encourage you to maybe be more nuanced, because I think that's an indefensible statement. I mean, clearly there is evidence for God. The only question is whether it's sufficient evidence to warrant belief.
Well, the only evidence, so-called evidence, that I've seen for God is argument. I haven't seen no observation.
Well, arguments are framings of evidence. So evidence gets plugged into an argument, right? Because evidence isn't self-interpreting. You have to get it. Especially when we're dealing with historical events, which happened in some cases millions of years ago.
It's not going to be easy, I grant you. But we're going back to the SETI example then, aren't we? Because at the moment, there's a strong argument for extraterrestrial intelligence, but no evidence. Because we're looking for observations, we haven't found any. And that's exactly parallel to any God, yours or whomsoever's. But this also reminds me, I mean, we could get into, the giraffe's recurrent nerve.
Yeah,
that one. But we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask you, because you did a lot on morals, I'm going to ask you whether you've heard of Stephen Law's evil God hypothesis.
Yeah, I have. Mm-hmm.
What's your response to that?
So remind me, it's been a while. I had him on my webinar a while ago, but I don't use the moral argument, so I don't really follow the literature extensively well on that.
Right. Well, Stephen points out that all of the arguments for God, for a omnibenevolent God,
right, are consistent with an evil God. Right. Yeah, I remember. Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everybody dismisses the evil God idea. So why can't we equally dismiss the benevolent God idea?
Yeah, so the arguments that I presented are point towards a morally good God because of the reasons I gave, that it's not at all improbable that a morally good God would bring into being a universe in which you've got a moral choice arena, like I described, but whereas it's immensely improbable on atheism. And furthermore, there's independent reason to think that the God who exists is none other than the God of the Bible or Judeo-Christianity. Right.
Well, you're making a presupposition there that there is a God, and then saying that that's why we have this moral agenda, moral arena.
No, it's evidence for that hypothesis, because this is where it comes down to, I think, where you don't really quite understand what evidence is. How do you define evidence?
Well, evidence to me is repeatable, shareable observations.
So when does something become evidence? When does an observation become evidence for your hypothesis?
Once it's been repeatedly observed and once it's become shareable. I mean, I wouldn't accept as evidence some person's claim to have seen something, but I would accept as evidence, here is, where you can look for it and see it for yourself.
I would define evidence as a Bayesian, as the evidence, the particular fact is evidence for your hypothesis, H, if and only if the probability of that evidence is greater given H than given non-H, right? And so
I accept that, but you're putting in where evidence is in the Bayesian equation. You're putting in argument.
I'm sorry, say that again.
In the Bayesian equation, where it requires evidence, you're putting in argument.
I put forward the evidence of the fine-tuning, the fact the universe had a beginning, the fine-tuning of the laws of constants, the information content of DNA and RNA, and so forth.
Yes, but that's a non sequitur. Just because the criteria exist doesn't mean that there's a link to Jesus. You have to provide a mechanism to connect the existing parameters, the conditions that exist in the universe to your God.
But I did. That's what I did in my presentation.
I must have blinked and missed that bit.
So the argument was that it's not at all implausible that God would bring into being a moral choice arena, given the way that I define God, and the fact, and so it's immensely more probable on the hypothesis of theism that such a moral choice arena would exist for the reasons that I gave, even assuming a charitably low probability of a moral choice arena on theism. And so the existence of the moral choice arena is therefore strong confirmatory evidence for theism over atheism.
Here's another question. What do you think about that?
Yeah, fine-tuning is defeated by the anthropic principle is the objection. John Leslie, who's a Christian, who's a philosopher, put forward the response to this, which is to imagine that you have you're taken before a firing squad and you're blindfolded, and you hear all the rifles go off and the blindfold is taken off and you're still alive, and you wonder, how come all the trained marksmen missed? And it wouldn't be logical for you to think, well, I shouldn't expect to be dead, because if I was dead, I wouldn't be here pondering why I'm still alive. So it doesn't. So the fact that we couldn't live in any other universe, and therefore it's not surprising that we do exist in a fine-tuned universe, doesn't really resolve the problem of why the universe is in fact fine-tuned for life to exist. It would be. It still doesn't remove the surprise of the fine-tuning of the universe.
It doesn't give an explanation to the why. But
exactly.
Yeah. But why is a question? It's not an answer. You're claiming that it is an answer by shoehorning in your God.
No, I'm saying that it's more probable on theism than on the falsehood of theism.
Well, there's a whole bunch of questions here from a Facebook user who didn't put his name in.
Okay. You claimed without evidence that embodied agents increase the opportunity to flourish. However, according to Christian theism, 1, humans will spend most of their time as resurrected agents in spiritual bodies rather than in physical ones. 2, our earthly bodies are regarded as a curse, not a blessing. 3, people in and of themselves have no opportunity to flourish because they lack the Holy Spirit. The person without the Spirit does not accept. We believe as Christians that everyone gets a physical resurrection, so it's not a spiritual body, it's a physical body at the resurrection. The bodies are regarded. I would disagree with the second point. Our earthly bodies are regarded as a curse, not a blessing. Yeah, I don't really understand what he's getting at there, I'm afraid.
Right. Okay. Well, you also talked about consciousness. But of course, consciousness is the very top of the tree. It's the result of the billions of years of evolution that have progressed up to that level. I would like to suggest that consciousness is not a very useful term because it is so exceptional. It is so associated with the most sophisticated of the organisms that we know about. Let's talk in terms of awareness. And there's definitely a progression of that. If you go back and look at the most simple creatures, some of them are barely able to distinguish light from dark. And then you gradually get up the scale to more awareness, and you get to a tree, for example, which, oh, he's gone. What happened there? I was saying you get to a tree which is aware of the seasons as it sheds its leaves in the autumn, maybe, and puts its flowers out in the spring. But our connection seems to have broken, folks. But thank you very much in absence, Jonathan. And thank you very much, viewers, for watching. Come again next week when we will have Brighton Science's Chief Executive, Richard Robinson, who wants our help in helping him to create his next book, which is aimed at children. So join in and make lots of suggestions for that. Sorry we lost Jonathan. Oh, he's back. Ah. Hello, Jonathan.
Sorry about that. I got disconnected from the internet, but I'm back.
Yeah, obviously. Well, I was in the process of thanking you for turning up and discussing with me and answering the questions of our audience and announcing the show for next week.
Excellent.
So maybe we'll do this again on a slightly different subject. What do you think?
For sure. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming. Bye-bye.